My name is Marlene, and am 32 years old. I'll never forget the moment the waiter placed that leather check holder directly in front of me at Bellini's, the most expensive Italian restaurant in downtown Boston. Around the table sat my mother, Constance, my stepfather Eugene, my half-sister Paulette with her husband Garrett, and my half-brother Vincent with his girlfriend Sloane. We'd just finished dessert, tiramisu and panna cotta all around. After appetizers, entrees, and 3 bottles of premium wine, everyone suddenly went silent. Eyes darted everywhere except toward me or that check. My mother examined her manicure. Eugene adjusted his cufflinks. Paulette whispered something to Garrett. Vincent pulled out his phone. And that's when I understood why they'd suddenly wanted me back in their lives after 3 years of complete silence. Before we dive deeper into what happened that night, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you've ever dealt with toxic family members who only contact you when they need something, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. Subscribe and turn on notifications because trust me, this story takes turns you won't believe, and you'll want to hear how I got my revenge. Now, let me take you back to the beginning so you understand exactly how I ended up in this nightmare. My childhood ended the day my father died in a car accident when I was 7 years old. One moment I had a dad who called me his little sunshine, who taught me to ride a bike and read me bedtime stories every single night. The next moment, he was gone, taken by a drunk driver on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. My mother, Constance, grieved for maybe 6 months before she met Eugene at some charity fundraiser. Within 18 months of my father's death, she remarried, and our modest but happy life transformed into something I barely recognized. Eugene came with money, lots of it, from his commercial real estate business. He also came with coldness, the kind that seeps into your bones and never quite leaves. He looked at me like I was a reminder of my mother's previous life, something inconvenient he had to tolerate. 2 years after they married, my half-sister Paulette was born, followed a year later by my half-brother Vincent. From the moment those babies arrived, I became invisible, or worse, I became the help. Paulette got the large bedroom, with the bay window overlooking our backyard garden. Vincent got the room next to it, filled with every toy and game you could imagine. I got moved to the smallest bedroom at the end of the hall, the one that used to be storage, with barely enough space for a twin bed and a narrow dresser. While Paulette and Vincent wore designer clothes and got new wardrobes every season, I wore hand-me-downs from neighbors and cousins, sizes that never quite fit right. When I asked why, my mother would sigh and say I needed to understand. I was the oldest. I should be mature enough to see that the babies needed more attention and resources, but they weren't babies anymore as the years went on, and the inequality only grew more glaring. Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone became a stark reminder that I was different, less than, not quite part of the real family. By the time I turned 14, I'd started working part-time jobs, babysitting for neighbors, then cashiering at a local grocery store once I was old enough. I saved every dollar because I knew I'd be on my own for college. For everything, really. My mother and Eugene made that crystal clear when I asked about college funds during my sophomore year of high school. Eugene actually laughed and said their money was earmarked for Paulette and Vincent's education at private universities. But I was smart and resourceful. Surely I could figure it out with scholarships and loans. So that's exactly what I did. I graduated high school with a grade point average high enough to earn partial scholarships to a state university 2 hours away. I worked 30 hours a week while carrying a full course load, studied nursing because I wanted to help people and because I knew it would lead to stable employment. I bought my own car, a 15-year-old sedan that broke down constantly but got me where I needed to go. I paid for my own textbooks, my own rent in a shared apartment with 3 roommates, my own food. Meanwhile, Paulette went to an elite liberal arts college in Vermont where tuition alone cost $60,000 a year, all expenses paid by Mom and Eugene. Vincent followed 2 years later to a prestigious university in New York. Same deal, everything covered, spending money included. When we'd gather for holidays during those years, I felt like hired help crashing a party where I didn't belong. They'd talk about spring break trips to Cancun and summer programs in Europe while I worked double shifts at the hospital where I'd gotten a nurse's aide position. It'd bring modest gifts I could barely afford while they exchanged expensive presents without a thought. I tried so hard to win their approval, to make them see me, to earn my place at the table. I worked myself to exhaustion, graduated with honors, got my nursing license, secured a good job at a major Boston hospital. I thought maybe if I was successful enough, accomplished enough, they'd finally respect me, maybe even love me the way they loved Paulette and Vincent. 3 years ago, I finally broke. It was at Vincent's college graduation party, a lavish affair at an expensive restaurant where Eugene rented out the entire back room. It'd just finished a 72-hour stretch at the hospital, 3 overnight shifts in a row, but I came anyway because family was supposed to matter. I brought Vincent a nice gift, a leather portfolio engraved with his initials, something professional for his future career. I watched as Eugene handed Vincent keys to a brand new luxury sedan, a graduation present that cost more than I made in 6 months. When Vincent opened my gift, he barely glanced at it before tossing it aside and saying thanks in a tone that made it clear he couldn't care less. Something inside me snapped. I pulled my mother aside and asked her quietly why she'd treated me so differently my entire life. Why I'd never been good enough for the same love and support she gave my half-siblings. She looked at me like I'd slapped her, then her face twisted into anger. She called me ungrateful, said I had no idea how lucky I'd been to have a roof over my head and food to eat after my father died. Eugene overheard and joined in, calling me dramatic and entitled, saying I owed them respect for raising me when they didn't have to. I looked at Paulette and Vincent, hoping they'd say something. Anything to defend me, or acknowledge the obvious unfairness. They both looked away, silent, and that silence was its own betrayal. I left that party and made a decision right then. I was done trying to earn love from people who would never give it. I blocked their numbers, unfriended them on social media, and started building a life that didn't revolve around seeking their approval. I found a therapist who helped me understand that what I'd experienced was emotional abuse and neglect, that the problem wasn't me, it was them. Slowly, painfully, I started healing. Then, 2 weeks before Christmas this year, my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Paulette, and she was crying, actually sobbing into the phone. She said she missed me terribly, that she'd been thinking about me constantly, that the family wasn't the same without me. She begged me to come to Christmas dinner, said Mom wanted to make amends, that she'd changed, that everyone realized how badly they'd treated me. I was skeptical, obviously, but there was a small part of me, that little girl who'd lost her dad and just wanted her mother to love her, that wanted to believe it might be true. Paulette suggested we meet at Bellini's, a 5-star Italian place downtown, and said it would be special, a new beginning for our family. Against my better judgment, against everything my therapist had worked on with me about boundaries and self-protection, I agreed. I told myself I'd stay guarded, that I'd leave at the first sign of trouble, but I'd give them one chance. And that's how I ended up sitting at that table on Christmas Eve, watching the waiter place an $847 check directly in front of me. The waiter was young, maybe early 20s, and he looked uncomfortable as he set down that leather folder containing our bill. My first instinct was confusion because I hadn't asked for the check, and typically the waiter asks who's paying or places it in the center of the table. But Head put it directly in front of my plate, and when I looked up at him questioningly, he avoided my eyes and hurried away. I opened the folder out of curiosity more than anything else, wanting to see the total from our elaborate meal, $847.56. My stomach dropped. The appetizers alone had been over $100, calamari and burrata and prosciutto plates that everyone had insisted we needed to try. The entrees were each between $40 and $60, osso, buco and branzino and wagyu beef that Eugene had recommended. And the wine. 3 bottles of some Italian red that cost $80 each, wine that Eugene had specifically asked the sommelier to bring. I hadn't ordered extravagantly myself. I'd gotten a simple pasta dish and had maybe 2 glasses of wine total, but clearly this check represented everyone's orders combined. I was about to ask who wanted to split it when my mother spoke up. Her voice had this bright, artificial quality that should have warned me immediately. She said, "Oh, Marlene, You've got it right. You invited us after all. I actually laughed because I thought she was joking. I said, "What are you talking about? Paulette called me 2 weeks ago. I didn't invite anyone." The table got very quiet, and then Paulette did something I'll never forget. She tilted her head, put on this confused expression, and said she distinctly remembered me saying on that phone call that I wanted to treat everyone, that I'd said it was my turn to host Christmas dinner, and I'd take care of everything. I stared at her, completely stunned, because that was an absolute lie, and we both knew it. I started to protest, to say, "That's not what happened at all," but Vincent jumped in to back her up. He said, "Yeah, Paulette told us you wanted to treat the family, that you felt bad about the estrangement and wanted to make it up to us." I looked around the table, hoping someone would tell the truth, but Garrett was studying his phone and Sloane was looking down at her lap. Eugene cleared his throat and said, "Well, we certainly wouldn't have ordered the premium wine if we'd known we were paying," his tone implying I'd somehow tricked them. My mother added in this syrupy voice that I shouldn't make a scene, that I made good money as a nurse. Surely I could afford one family dinner after being gone for 3 years. The injustice of it hit me like a physical blow. They'd coordinated this, all of it, from Paulette's tearful phone call to the choice of an expensive restaurant to their strategic ordering of the priciest items on the menu. This had been the plan all along, to lure me back with promises of reconciliation and then stick me with a massive bill. I could feel other diners starting to notice our table, the tension and raised voices drawing attention. The waiter hovered nearby, clearly unsure what to do, probably worried he wouldn't get tipped if this turned into a full-blown confrontation. My mind raced through options. I could refuse to pay and walk out, but they'd probably cause an even bigger scene and I'd be humiliated in front of a restaurant full of strangers. I could demand we split the check fairly, but they'd already constructed their narrative, and they'd just paint me as cheap and vindictive. I could pay and never speak to them again. But then they'd have won. They'd have successfully exploited me, and probably felt justified in doing it. Part of me wanted to flip the table and scream at them, to tell everyone in that restaurant exactly what kind of people they were. But I was raised to be polite, to avoid confrontation, to swallow my anger and keep the peace. So I made a decision in that moment that surprised even me. I would pay the check, I would smile and act gracious, but this would be the last time they ever manipulated me. More than that, I would make sure they eventually paid a price far higher than $800. I reached into my purse, pulled out my credit card, and handed it to the hovering waiter with a smile that felt like it might crack my face. I said, "Merry Christmas, family," my treat, managing to keep my voice steady even though I was shaking with rage. The transformation around the table was instantaneous and disgusting. Suddenly, everyone was cheerful, thanking me, saying how generous I was, how they'd known it'd come around. My mother actually patted my hand and said we should do this again soon, maybe for New Year's Eve. Wouldn't that be lovely? Eugene suggested I might want to help with some home renovations they'd been planning, since I was clearly doing so well financially. Paulette hugged me and whispered that she was so glad to have her big sister back. Vincent raised his empty wine glass in a mock toast to family. I signed the receipt when the waiter returned, added a 20% tip because it wasn't his fault my family were monsters, and gathered my coat. As we all stood to leave, they made plans to get together again, talking about future dinners and holidays, already calculating how else they could use me. In the parking lot, I told them I needed to make a phone call and would catch up with them in a minute. They barely acknowledged me, too busy laughing among themselves and walking toward their cars. I stood by my sedan, pretending to be on my phone, but really I was activating the voice recording app. Something told me to wait, to listen, and that instinct saved me. Their voices carried in the cold December air, not realizing I was still within earshot. I heard my mother's laugh, loud and sharp, saying, "I can't believe that worked." $800 she just handed over. Eugenia's voice responded that Head told her it'd be easy, desperate for approval. "We can milk this for months." Paulette asked if they should hit me up again for New Year's. And Vincent said, "Mom, what about that renovation loan you need?" My mother's response made my blood run cold. She said, "Oh, Marlene will help with that too. I'll cry about losing the house. She'll fall for it. She always wants to play the hero." They discussed me like I was an ATM machine, laughing about how pathetic I was, planning their next exploitation. I recorded every word, my hands trembling with a mixture of rage and something else, clarity. I finally saw them exactly as they were, and I'd never unsee it again. I sat in my car for a long time after they drove away, listening to that recording over and over again. Each playback made me angrier, but it also made me sharper, more determined. The drive back to my apartment felt surreal, like I was moving through a dream, or maybe a nightmare. My small one-bedroom place had never looked so welcoming, a space that was entirely mine, paid for with money I'd earned through my own hard work. I made myself tea, sat down at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop. $847 was a significant chunk of my savings, money I'd been setting aside for a down payment on a small house someday. It hurt to lose it, but what hurt more was the realization that it'd been right to cut them off 3 years ago, and it'd been foolish to think people like that could change. I pulled up my bank account, confirmed the charge had posted, and then I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I looked up my family on social media. I'd blocked them on my personal accounts, but I created a dummy profile now, just to see what they'd been posting, what their lives really looked like. What I found made everything so much worse. Eugene's business wasn't just doing well, it was thriving. His company's page showed recent acquisitions, expansions, coverage in business magazines. He was worth millions, easily, and growing wealthier by the month. There was no financial struggle, no threat to their lifestyle, nothing that would justify squeezing me for money. Paulette's personal page, which she'd set to public for some reason, showed her standing next to a brand new luxury SUV in her driveway. The post was from 2 days ago, 2 days before our Christmas dinner, showing off her quote-unquote Christmas present to herself. The SUV cost at least $70,000 based on the model and features she'd tagged. Vincent's Instagram was full of photos from a ski trip to Aspen, posted just hours before our dinner, showing him and Sloane at an expensive resort, eating at upscale restaurants, staying in a suite that probably cost $1,000 a night. My mother's Facebook page showed her wearing designer clothes in every photo, attending charity galas and country club events, her wrist dripping with jewelry that cost more than I made in a year. These people weren't broke. They weren't struggling. They were wealthy, comfortable, living lives of luxury and excess. They'd squeezed me for $800 not because they needed it, but because they could, because they enjoyed it, because exercising power over me gave them some sick satisfaction. I felt nauseous. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about cruelty for cruelty's sake, about taking pleasure in manipulating someone they'd already spent decades mistreating. I realized that Christmas dinner had been a test. If I paid without fighting back, they'd know I was vulnerable, that they could keep exploiting me indefinitely. The renovation loan my mother had mentioned in the parking lot would be next, probably requesting $10,000 or $15,000, and if I gave them that, they'd come back for more and more until they'd bled me dry. I thought about calling them out, sending an angry text with screenshots of their social media posts, exposing their lies, but something stopped me. Anger wouldn't accomplish anything except making me look unstable and giving them ammunition to paint me as the villain. No, if I was going to do this, I needed to be smart about it. I needed evidence, witnesses, and a plan that would expose them so thoroughly they'd never be able to manipulate anyone again. That's when I thought of my Aunt Dorothy, my father's younger sister who I'd lost touch with over the years. Before my mother remarried, Aunt Dorothy had been a constant presence in my life, taking me for weekends and school breaks, making sure I knew my father's family loved me. But after Eugene entered the picture, those visits became less frequent, and eventually my mother made excuses about why I couldn't see my father's side of the family anymore. It always assumed they'd simply moved on, gotten busy with their own lives, but now I wondered if there was more to the story. I found Aunt Dorothy's number in an old contact list I'd saved and called before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the third ring, and when she heard my voice, she actually started crying. She said, "Marlene, oh, sweetheart, I've been trying to reach you for years, and my heart nearly broke." We talked for 2 hours that night, and what she told me changed everything. Apparently, my mother and Eugene had been bad-mouthing me to my father's side of the family for years, telling them I'd stolen money from the household, that I'd been verbally abusive to my younger siblings, that I'd cut everyone off for no reason because I was mentally unstable. They'd systematically destroyed my reputation among my father's relatives, making sure I'd be isolated with no one to turn to. Aunt Dorothy said Shed believed the lies at first, to her shame. But about a year ago, Shed started questioning the narrative because it didn't match the little girl Shed known. Shed tried to reach out to me, but I'd changed my number, and my mother had told her I'd moved out of state and didn't want contact with anyone. My Uncle Bernard, my father's older brother who was a lawyer, had also been asking questions recently, suspicious about some financial irregularities related to my father's estate. Apparently, my father had left me a trust fund, nothing huge but enough to help with college and getting started in life, and it was supposed to be held by my mother until I turned 25. But when Uncle Bernard had inquired about it on my behalf after getting suspicious, the money was gone, absorbed into my mother's accounts, used for who knows what. They'd stolen my inheritance, lied about me to my father's family, and isolated me so completely it had no one to turn to. I told Aunt Dorothy everything. The Christmas dinner, the parking lot recording, the fake poverty story while living in obvious wealth, the planned renovation loan scam. I sent her the audio file, and I could hear her crying as she listened to it. When she finished, her voice was steel. She said, "We're going to fix this. Sweetheart, you're not alone anymore." She conferenced in Uncle Bernard, who listened to everything grimly, and then said he'd been waiting for evidence like this. We made a plan right there, the three of them helping me strategize. But we needed more than just one recording. We needed to catch them in multiple lies, document their patterns, and expose them publicly with witnesses who could corroborate everything. Uncle Bernard said he had a friend who worked in private investigation, someone discreet who could help gather more evidence. Aunt Dorothy suggested I play along with their next scheme. Whatever it was, but this time I'd be prepared, recording everything, building a case. My cousin Iris, Aunt Dorothy's daughter, who was around my age and worked in social media marketing, offered to help document and organize all the evidence, making it presentable and undeniable. By the time we hung up at 2 in the morning, I had a team, a plan, and for the first time in my life, my father's family standing behind me completely. The next morning, I woke up feeling different, purposeful in a way I hadn't felt in years. I met Aunt Dorothy and Iris at a small cafe across town, where none of my mother's social circle would ever go. Over coffee and bagels, we went through every detail of the Christmas dinner, the parking lot conversation, and what I'd found on social media. Iris took notes on her tablet, already thinking like the strategist she was, talking about timelines and documentation and eventual public exposure. She explained that social media had given people a powerful tool for telling their truths, but it had to be done right, with evidence that couldn't be disputed and a narrative that was clear and compelling. She'd seen too many cases where someone tried to expose family abuse only to be labeled as bitter or crazy because they didn't present their case effectively. We couldn't let that happen to me. Uncle Bernard arrived about an hour into our meeting, bringing his friend Jasper, a former police detective who now worked as a private investigator. Jasper was in his 50s, calm and methodical, and he listened to my story without interrupting. When I finished, he asked to hear the parking lot recording, and I played it for him. He nodded slowly and said, "This is good. This shows clear intent to defraud. But we need more. We need to catch them actually attempting to scam you again, preferably with specific dollar amounts and false claims we can verify." The plan we developed was both simple and risky. I would text my mother in a few days, after enough time had passed that the Christmas dinner felt like a success to them. I'd mentioned that I'd been thinking about what Shed said about the house and renovations, playing the role of the concerned daughter who wanted to help. If she took the bait, which we all felt confident she would, I'd arranged to meet her for lunch to discuss the details. Iris would help me set up a hidden camera, probably a button camera or something in my purse, so we could record the entire conversation without my mother knowing. Uncle Bernard coached me on what questions to ask, how to get her to be specific about the dollar amounts she needed, and what the money was supposedly for, and how to frame things so Shed make clearly false statements we could later disprove. Jasper said he'd run background checks on Eugene's business and financial records, all public information, so we'd have documentation showing they weren't actually in financial distress. He'd also look into the trust fund situation, working with Uncle Bernard, to gather evidence about what had happened to my father's money. Aunt Dorothy's role would be to quietly reach out to other members of my father's family, people who'd been told lies about me, and start planting seeds of doubt about my mother's narrative without revealing our full plan yet. We spent the whole day together, and it felt like healing. These people, my father's people, cared about me not because of what I could give them, but because I was family. Because they remembered my father and wanted to honor his memory by protecting his daughter. Aunt Dorothy told me stories about my dad that I'd never heard. Things from his childhood and young adulthood that made him feel real and present in a way he hadn't been since I was 7. Uncle Bernard showed me photos he'd saved from when I was little, pictures of me with my father that my mother had never given me copies of, and I cried looking at them, seeing how happy we'd been together. Iris talked about her own experiences with toxic people and how Shed had to cut off her ex-fiancé when she realized he was only using her, and it helped to know I wasn't alone in having been manipulated by people I'd trusted. By the end of that day, I felt stronger than I had in years, ready to face whatever came next. 3 days after Christmas, I sent my mother a carefully worded text message. I said I'd been thinking about our lovely dinner and how good it felt to reconnect with family. I mentioned that I'd heard her talking about needing help with house renovations, and I wanted to discuss how I might be able to contribute because family was so important to me, and I wanted to do my part. I kept the tone warm and naive, like someone who hadn't overheard the parking lot conversation, like someone who genuinely believed her mother cared about her. The response came within 10 minutes, and it was exactly what Wed predicted. My mother texted back with effusive gratitude, saying she was so touched that I wanted to help, that she hadn't wanted to burden me, but the situation with the house was getting desperate. She suggested we meet for lunch the following Tuesday at a quiet cafe she liked, just the two of us, mother and daughter, so we could have a real heart-to-heart conversation. I confirmed the meeting, and then called Iris, who immediately started researching camera options that would work for our purposes. On Tuesday morning, Iris came to my apartment early to help me set up. Shed purchased a high-quality button camera that looked completely normal, just part of my cardigan, but recorded both video and audio in high definition. We tested it multiple times to make sure the angle was right and the sound was clear. Uncle Bernard called to go over his coaching points again, reminding me to stay calm no matter what she said, to ask clarifying questions, and to get her to be as specific as possible about dollar amounts and what the money was needed for. He also reminded me that lying to a family member wasn't illegal, but if she presented false documents or made fraudulent claims as part of a scheme to get money, that could potentially be prosecuted as fraud, which gave us legal leverage even if we never actually pressed charges. The point was to gather enough evidence that they couldn't deny what they'd done, couldn't spin it or gaslight me or anyone else. I dressed carefully in a nice but unremarkable outfit, the camera button hidden among several others on my sweater. I practiced my expressions in the mirror, making sure I could look hopeful and trusting even though my stomach was churning with anger and nerves. The cafe my mother had chosen was in an upscale neighborhood, the kind of place where a salad cost $20 and everyone spoke in hushed, refined tones. She was already seated when I arrived, dressed elegantly as always, her highlighted hair perfect, her makeup flawless. She stood and hugged me, and I had to fight the urge to pull away because her embrace felt like a spider wrapping up its prey. We ordered lunch. She got a fancy grain bowl and I got soup, and then she launched into her performance. It was truly Oscar-worthy. Tears welled up in her eyes as she talked about how much Shed missed me over the past 3 years, how Shed been doing a lot of soul-searching and therapy, how she realized she hadn't treated me fairly when I was growing up. She reached across the table and took my hand, saying she wanted to make things right, to really be a mother to me the way she should have been all along. I played my part perfectly, acting moved by her words, telling her I'd always wanted a real relationship with her. Then she transitioned smoothly into the real purpose of our meeting, the house and the supposed crisis. My mother's story was elaborate and detailed, clearly something Shed rehearsed. She explained that Eugenia's business had hit some rough patches in the past year. Nothing catastrophic, but enough that they'd had to dip into savings and put off some necessary repairs to their house. Now, apparently, they had a serious foundation problem that needed immediate attention, or the house could suffer structural damage. The repair estimates were coming in around $15,000, and they simply didn't have liquid cash available without selling investments at a bad time. Her voice broke convincingly as she said she was so ashamed to ask. That Shed never wanted to be the kind of mother who was a burden to her child, but I was doing so well in my career, and maybe just a loan that Shed pay back over time, and it would save their home. I asked questions just like Uncle Bernard had coached me, gentle inquiries about why they couldn't get a home equity loan or use credit. She had answers ready for everything. They'd already maxed out their home equity line for previous renovations. Their credit cards had been used for Vincent's graduate school expenses that weren't covered by his funding. Every excuse designed to explain why they specifically needed cash from me. When I asked how soon they needed the money, she said ideally within a week. Foundation issues couldn't wait, and the contractors had an opening in their schedule right now, but it had to be secured with a deposit. I told her I'd need to check my finances, see what I could do, but I wanted to help because family took care of each other. She smiled. That warm, grateful smile that would have fooled me completely if I hadn't heard her laughing about manipulating me in that parking lot. We finished lunch. She paid for both of us with a credit card that didn't look like it belonged to someone in financial crisis, and we hugged goodbye. She reminded me as I left that Shed pay back every penny, she promised. Just as soon as Eugenie's business recovered, I walked to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for an hour. The camera had recorded everything, and I immediately called Iris to let her know. She told me to come straight to Uncle Bernard's office. They wanted to review the footage while it was fresh. That afternoon, the three of us plus Jasper sat in Uncle Bernard's conference room and watched the video twice. Jasper took notes, commenting on specific lies that we could easily disprove. Uncle Bernard pointed out that Shed made concrete false statements about their financial situation, which combined with the request for money, constituted attempted fraud if we wanted to pursue it legally. But we all agreed the goal wasn't actually to press charges. It was to expose them publicly and completely, to make sure everyone in their social circle knew exactly what kind of people they were. Jasper had come prepared with his own research. He pulled out a folder thick with documents and printouts. Eugenie's business wasn't struggling at all. It was having one of its best years on record based on commercial real estate transactions that were public information. Their house, which I'd grown up in, had no recent permit applications for foundation work, which there would have been if they were really planning major structural repairs. Had also pulled their property tax records, which showed the house's assessed value had actually increased over the past few years, indicating it was well maintained, not falling apart. Credit checks, which he could access through his investigator channels, showed they had excellent credit scores and weren't carrying unusual debt. Every single thing my mother had told me was a verifiable lie, and we had documentation to prove it. Uncle Bernard also had news about the trust fund investigation. Had found the original trust documents my father had set up before he died, and they clearly stated that money was meant for me, to be held by my mother as trustee, but distributed to me by age 25 for educational and life establishment purposes. I was now 32, and I'd never received a penny of that money. The trust had contained $50,000 at the time of my father's death, and with basic investment returns over the years, it should have grown to at least $70,000 or $80,000 by the time I was meant to receive it. Instead, my mother had gradually drained the account, transferring money to her personal accounts with vague justifications in the trustee reports, until it was empty by the time I turned 26. She'd stolen my inheritance, and we had all the documentation to prove it. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. That money could have changed my life, could have paid for college without loans, could have given me a cushion when I was working 3 jobs and barely sleeping, could have been the down payment on a house by now, and she'd just taken it, spent it on herself and her family with Eugene, and never told me it had even existed. Aunt Dorothy put her arm around me while I processed this, and I cried angry, bitter tears for what had been stolen from me, not just money but opportunities and security and peace of mind. Uncle Bernard said quietly that we could pursue legal action to recover the funds, that we had a strong case for trustee malfeasance and conversion of assets. I nodded, but right then I was too overwhelmed to think about lawsuits and legal proceedings. All I could think about was how my mother had looked me in the eyes at lunch, lied repeatedly to extract more money from me, and felt no remorse whatsoever. These people weren't just toxic, they were genuinely dangerous, and they'd keep victimizing people as long as they could get away with it. 3 days after that lunch meeting, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and it was Paulette, my half-sister, and she was sobbing hysterically. She could barely get words out between heaving cries, gasping about Vincent, and an accident, and the hospital. My heart raced despite myself, some primal instinct to care about family even when they'd hurt me. And I asked what happened. Where was he? Was he okay? Paulette said there'd been a terrible accident. Vincent was in the hospital and needed emergency surgery, something with internal injuries, and the insurance company was refusing to cover it, claiming something about the policy. They needed $8,000 by tomorrow to proceed with the surgery, or the hospital would have to discharge him, and they had no one else to turn to. Could I please help? Could I wire the money immediately? Every instinct I'd developed over the past week told me this was another scam, but the panic in her voice sounded so real. And what if it was true? What if Vincent was really hurt and I refused to help, and something happened to him? I told Paulette I'd come to the hospital right now. I'd bring my nursing credentials and talk to the doctors myself, figure out what was really going on. There was a pause, just a beat too long, and then she said no, I couldn't come. He was in surgery already, and they weren't allowing visitors. I just needed to wire the money to a specific account. She'd text me the details. That's when I knew for certain it was fake. I kept my voice concerned and asked which hospital because I worked at Mercy General and I could check his records, pull some strings maybe. Paulette fumbled, said actually it's Mercy General. What a coincidence. And I knew I had her. I said great, I'm already here actually, just finishing my shift. Which room is he in? I'll come right now. She made some excuse about not knowing the room number. Everything had happened so fast. But I cut her off and said it'd just check the admissions system. We could look up any patient. I actually put Paulette on hold, walked over to a computer terminal at the nurse's station, and searched for Vincent's name in our hospital system. Nothing. I checked every hospital in the greater Boston area that our system connected to. Nothing. Vincent wasn't admitted anywhere. There'd been no accident, no surgery, no insurance crisis. This was a completely fabricated emergency designed to extract $8,000 from me with urgency and emotion as their weapons. I got back on the phone and told Paulette I couldn't find him in the system. Could she please confirm the spelling of his last name and his date of birth? She hung up, just disconnected the call without another word. I stood there in the hospital hallway, shaking with rage. They'd tried to scam me twice in less than 2 weeks, and they were getting bolder, more aggressive, willing to fake medical emergencies and play on family bonds they'd never honored themselves. I called Iris immediately, and she told me to call Vincent's number from a different phone, maybe a work phone or burner, just to confirm he was fine. I used one of the hospital's public phones and dialed Vincent's cell. He answered on the second ring, sounding cheerful and relaxed, with background noise that sounded like ski lifts and wind. I asked if this was Vincent, disguising my voice slightly, and he said yeah. Who's this? I hung up. He was fine, perfectly healthy, probably still in Aspen or on some other vacation. I immediately called Aunt Dorothy and Uncle Bernard, filling them in on this new development. Jasper said this was actually perfect for our case because it showed an escalating pattern of fraud attempts, moving from the social manipulation of the Christmas dinner to direct false requests for money to now fabricating emergencies. He asked if I'd recorded the call with Paulette, and I kicked myself for not thinking of it, but I'd been caught off guard by the emotional manipulation. He said it was okay. We had enough evidence already, but this incident would be part of the timeline we presented. Uncle Bernard suggested I dig deeper into my mother's history, because patterns like this usually had a longer track record than we'd discovered so far. Jasper offered to look into Constance's background, her previous relationships before my father, any public records that might show other questionable behavior. What he found 2 days later was disturbing but not surprising. My mother had been married once before my father, briefly, to a man named Walter, when she was in her early 20s. The marriage lasted less than 3 years before Walter filed for divorce. Jasper managed to track down Walter, who was now in his 60s and living in New Hampshire. I called him, introduced myself as Constance's daughter, and said I was trying to understand some family history. Walter was quiet for a moment, then asked if Constance had hurt me, and the way he asked, with such knowing sadness, told me everything I needed to know. We talked for over an hour, and Walter told me a story that sounded horrifyingly familiar. Constance had love-bombed him when they first met, made him feel like the most important person in the world, rushed into marriage, then slowly, systematically, Shed isolated him from his friends and family, told lies about him to people in his life, manipulated him financially, and when Shed extracted everything she could, Shed discarded him and moved on. Had spent years recovering from what he now recognized as emotional and financial abuse. He warned me that people like my mother didn't change, they just found new victims, and the best thing I could do was get away and stay away. I thanked him and promised to send him some information about what I was planning, and he said he'd testify if I needed him to, that he'd be happy to help stop her from hurting anyone else. I realized my mother was what the therapist would probably call a sociopath, someone without empathy or genuine emotional connection, someone who viewed people as resources to be exploited rather than human beings to be valued. Eugene was either a victim like Walter or a willing accomplice who'd found someone who matched his own lack of empathy. Paulette and Vincent had been raised by these people, shaped by their values or lack thereof, and they'd learned that manipulation and exploitation were normal, acceptable, even admirable. The saddest part was recognizing that even if it'd been the perfect daughter, even if it'd done everything they ever asked, it wouldn't have mattered. They would have kept taking because taking was what they did. It was never about me being good enough. It was about them being fundamentally broken in ways I couldn't fix. With everything we'd discovered and documented, it was time to move to the final phase of our plan. I called my mother 2 days after the fake hospital emergency, playing my role perfectly. I said I'd been thinking about her situation, and I wanted to help with the renovation loan, that I'd been reviewing my finances and I could probably manage $15,000. Her voice lit up with triumph, disguised as gratitude, and she said she didn't know how to thank me. I was saving their home. I was such a wonderful daughter. I let her gush for a few minutes. Then I said I wanted to do something more, something bigger, to really mark our family reconciliation. I offered to host a New Year's Eve party for the whole family, my treat, at a nice venue, to celebrate starting fresh and putting the past behind us. I said I'd invite everyone, immediate family and extended family too, make it a real celebration. She jumped at the idea, probably already calculating how much more money she could extract from me with a larger audience to manipulate. I told her I'd handle all the arrangements. All she needed to do was show up with Eugene, Paulette, Vincent, and anyone else from her side of the family who wanted to come. What my mother didn't know was that I'd be inviting my own guests too. Aunt Dorothy reached out to my father's side of the family, all the relatives who'd been told lies about me, inviting them to a family reunion on New Year's Eve, saying it was time they heard the truth about what had been happening. Uncle Bernard contacted some of Eugenie's business partners, people who valued their reputations and would be very interested to learn about financial fraud and manipulation within their professional network. Iris got in touch with some people from Paulette's social circle and Vincent's graduate program, extending invitations under the guise of networking and celebration. I wanted an audience, people who knew my mother and stepfamily, people who'd been impressed by their wealth and status, people who could spread the truth far and wide once they witnessed what I was about to reveal. I rented a private dining room at a very nice restaurant downtown, a space that could hold about 50 people comfortably. I arranged for a screen and projector, telling the venue it was for a photo slideshow but actually planning something very different. In the days leading up to New Year's Eve, Uncle Bernard and Iris helped me prepare a presentation. We compiled all our evidence into a clear, chronological timeline that started with my childhood and the unequal treatment, moved through the 3-year estrangement, showed the Christmas dinner setup and parking lot recording, documented the lunch meeting with my mother's lies about the renovation loan, included the fake hospital emergency, revealed the stolen trust fund with all supporting documents, and even included Walter's testimony about my mother's past pattern of abuse. We edited it into a video presentation, about 20 minutes long, with dates and facts and audio recordings and documents all clearly labeled. It was devastating, undeniable, and professional. We made sure everything was verified and true because we couldn't give them any opening to claim we'd lied or exaggerated. Iris helped me write a script for what I'd say when I presented this, keeping it factual and unemotional, letting the evidence speak for itself. Uncle Bernard reviewed everything from a legal perspective, making sure we weren't opening ourselves up to defamation claims, confirming that truth was an absolute defense and everything we were presenting was documentable fact. The day of New Year's Eve arrived, and I barely slept the night before. I was nervous, absolutely terrified if I'm honest, but I was also determined. I arrived at the restaurant early to make sure everything was set up correctly. The screen in place, the projector working, the presentation loaded and ready. Aunt Dorothy, Uncle Bernard, and Iris arrived next, along with several other relatives from my father's side, people I was meeting for the first time or reconnecting with after decades. They hugged me, told me how much I looked like my father, shared their excitement about finally learning the truth. Eugene's business partners arrived, 3 well-dressed men and 2 women who knew Eugene professionally but were curious about this family celebration I'd described. Paulette's friends and Vincent's colleagues came, young people expecting a fun New Year's party. Then my mother's family started arriving, and the contrast was stark. Constance swept in wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, Eugene beside her in an expensive suit, both of them radiating wealth and confidence. Paulette and Garrett followed, she in cocktails and heels, he looking uncomfortable as usual. Vincent arrived with Sloane, both of them dressed for an upscale party, clearly expecting an evening of free food and networking. The look on my mother's face when she saw the size of the gathering was priceless. Surprise and confusion followed quickly by a calculating expression as she realized how many people she could potentially manipulate or impress. She made her rounds, greeting people with air kisses and compliments, introducing Eugene as a successful businessman, presenting Paulette and Vincent as her accomplished children. I watched her work the room. This woman had caused me so much pain, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. In a few minutes, her carefully constructed facade would shatter, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. We served appetizers and drinks first, letting everyone relax and mingle. I played the perfect hostess, warm and welcoming, making sure everyone had what they needed. My mother came over at one point and whispered that I'd really outdone myself. This must have cost a fortune. Was I sure I could afford it? I smiled and said not to worry. It was worth every penny, and it absolutely was. After about an hour, once everyone had arrived and settled in, I clinked my glass to get everyone's attention. I stood near the screen at the front of the room, and gradually conversations died down as people turned to face me. I saw my mother's face, expectant and pleased, probably thinking I was about to give some speech thanking her for being such a wonderful mother and announcing the renovation loan publicly. Eugene raised his champagne glass, already prepared to accept praise. Paulette and Vincent exchanged smirks, likely anticipating another easy exploitation. I took a breath and began speaking. I started my speech with words I'd practiced a dozen times. I said thank you all for coming tonight to help me celebrate New Year's Eve. But more importantly, to help me celebrate truth. I explained that I'd gathered everyone here because family was incredibly important to me, and I'd learned some difficult lessons about what family really meant. I said I wanted to share my story because some of the people in this room had been lied to about me for years, and they deserved to know the truth. I especially wanted to thank my mother Constance, my stepfather Eugene, my half-sister Paulette, and my half-brother Vincent for teaching me those lessons, even though their methods were painful. I saw confusion start to ripple through the crowd, saw my mother's smile falter slightly. I said I wanted to start by sharing something that happened on Christmas Eve, just 1 week ago, and I pressed play on the presentation. The screen lit up with the date and location, December 24th, Christmas Eve, Bellina's Restaurant, parking lot, 10:45 p.m. Then the audio began, crystal clear in the silent room. My mother's voice came through the speakers saying, "I can't believe that worked." $800 she just handed over, and the entire room went still. Eugenia's voice followed, saying, "Told you shed be easy." Desperate for approval. "We can milk this for months." Paulette's voice asking about New Year's, Vincent mentioning the renovation loan, my mother explaining how she'd cry about losing the house, and I'd fall for it because I always wanted to play the hero. They discussed me like I was an object, laughing, planning their next exploitation. The audio played for 2 minutes that felt like an eternity, and I watched my mother's face go from confusion to recognition to horror. She opened her mouth to say something, but Uncle Bernard, who'd positioned himself near her table, simply said, "Let it play. Everyone needs to hear this." The presentation moved to the next section, showing a timeline of my childhood with dated photos and documents. Report cards showing I'd paid for my own school supplies starting in middle school. Bank statements from my teenage years showing deposits from part-time jobs. College loan documents showing I'd financed my entire education while Paulette and Vincent's private university tuition was paid in full by our parents. Text messages from years of me trying to maintain relationships while being repeatedly dismissed and devalued. The evidence was overwhelming, and people in the room started whispering, looking between the screen and my mother's family with dawning understanding. Then we played the recording from the lunch meeting, my mother's voice full of fake tears talking about the foundation problems, and Eugenia's struggling business and their desperate need for $15,000. Immediately after, the presentation showed public records, Eugenia's business acquisitions from the past year, property records showing no permit applications for foundation work, their excellent credit scores, the luxury SUV Paulette had posted about on social media. Every lie was systematically disproven with documentation. Next came screenshots of Vincent's social media from the day Paulette had called about the fake hospital emergency, showing him healthy and happy at a ski resort. We played a brief recording of the phone call where Paulette claimed Vincent was in surgery, followed by hospital records confirming he'd never been admitted. The exploitation attempts were laid out in damning detail, each one more desperate and cruel than the last. But we weren't done. The presentation moved to the stolen trust fund, showing my father's original trust documents, the trustee reports where my mother had gradually drained the account, calculations showing that $70,000 that should have been mine had been stolen. Uncle Bernard had included a legal expert's opinion stating this constituted clear trustee malfeasance and conversion of assets. The room was completely silent now except for occasional gasps. I could see Eugenie's business partners exchanging horrified looks, their association with him suddenly toxic. Paulette's friends were staring at her with disgust. Vincent's girlfriend Sloane had her hand over her mouth, shaking her head. The final section of the presentation featured Walter, my mother's first husband, speaking directly to the camera in an interview Jasper had recorded with his permission. Walter calmly described how Constance had isolated him from his family, manipulated him financially, and discarded him once she'd gotten what she wanted. He said he recognized the pattern immediately when Id contacted him, that people like Constance were dangerous and usually left trails of victims behind them. He looked directly into the camera and said to anyone who'd been manipulated by her, "You're not alone, you're not crazy, and it's not your fault." The video ended with a simple text screen. "These are the documented facts. Truth matters. Family should uplift, not exploit." I turned off the projector and faced the room. My mother jumped to her feet, her face twisted with rage. She started shouting that this was taken out of context, that Id manipulated the recordings, that I was mentally unstable and had always been a problem child. But Aunt Dorothy stood up from her table and said in a clear, carrying voice, "I'm Marlene's aunt, her father's sister, and I was told for years that she'd stolen from you and cut off the family for no reason, and now I know those were lies. You isolated her from everyone who would have protected her." Uncle Bernard stood as well, introducing himself as an attorney and Marlene's uncle, saying he was prepared to file both civil and potentially criminal charges related to the trust fund theft if Constance didn't want to settle immediately. Eugene tried a different tack, attempting to laugh it off, saying families have misunderstandings and this was all being blown out of proportion. But one of his business partners stood and said, "Eugene, if this is how you treat family, I have serious concerns about our professional relationship, and I'll be reviewing all our joint ventures with my legal team." The others nodded in agreement and started moving toward the exit. Paulette looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Her friends were gathering their things, one of them saying loudly that she couldn't believe she'd ever trusted someone who would fake a medical emergency to steal money. Garrett, Paulette's husband, stood suddenly and said he was leaving. They'd talk later, but he needed to think about some things, his expression making clear he was questioning his entire marriage. Vincent's girlfriend Sloane walked out without a word, and Vincent called after her desperately, but she didn't look back. The room was emptying of everyone except my father's family and a few people who stayed out of morbid curiosity. My mother tried different tactics in quick succession, anger giving way to tears, tears giving way to threats. She said I'd regret this, that I'd destroyed the family, that she'd make sure everyone knew what a horrible person I was. Eugene said they'd sue me for defamation, but Uncle Bernard simply smiled and said, "Truth is an absolute defense to defamation. Every single thing in that presentation is documented fact. Please try to sue. I'd love to enter all of this into public court record." The last thing my mother said before storming out, dragging Eugene with her, was that I was dead to her. She had no daughter. I'd never been good enough anyway. Paulette and Vincent followed their mother like children following the Pied Piper, none of them capable of independent thought or moral action. The door slammed behind them, and for a moment the room was silent. Then Aunt Dorothy started clapping, slow and deliberate, and soon my father's entire family joined in, applauding not my vengeance but my courage to tell the truth. People came up to hug me, to apologize for believing lies, to welcome me back into the family I'd never really known. Several of them said my father would be proud of me for standing up for myself. And I broke down crying because I hoped that was true. I hoped somewhere he could see that his little sunshine had learned to fight back. The morning after New Year's Eve, I woke up feeling strangely peaceful despite the chaos I knew was coming. The party had ended with my father's family surrounding me with love and support, making plans for regular gatherings, and promising I'd never be alone again. Wed stayed at the restaurant until after midnight, bringing in the new year with people who actually cared about me, and it felt like the first honest celebration I'd had in decades. But I knew the fallout was just beginning. My phone started buzzing with notifications around 8 a.m., and when I checked social media, I saw that my mother had launched her counteroffensive. She'd posted a long, rambling statement on Facebook claiming that I was mentally ill, that I'd always been troubled and jealous of my siblings, that I'd manipulated recordings and fabricated evidence because I was angry about not being included in family money. She painted herself as a victim of a disturbed daughter's vendetta, and she'd clearly been up all night crafting this narrative. The post had dozens of comments already, some from her social circle offering support, but increasingly there were comments from people who'd been at the party last night saying, "No, we were there, we heard the evidence, this is a lie." Iris called me around 9 to say she'd been monitoring social media and had already started posting responses from the official accounts she'd created for this purpose. She'd uploaded selected portions of the evidence, the recordings and documents, making them publicly available so anyone could verify the truth. She'd also reached out to some of the attendees from last night, asking if they'd be willing to post their own accounts of what they'd witnessed, and several had agreed. By mid-morning, the narrative my mother was trying to spin was already falling apart because too many people had seen the evidence firsthand. Eugene tried to do damage control in the business community, reaching out to his partners with explanations and justifications, but the damage was done. Uncle Bernard had already sent formal letters to Eugene's top 3 business partners outlining the fraud, attempts, and theft, asking them to consider whether they wanted to be associated with someone of questionable character. 2 of the 3 responded within hours, saying they'd be terminating their business relationships with Eugene effective immediately. Over the next few days, the consequences spread like ripples in a pond. Paulette's marriage became openly strained when Garrett moved out of their house and filed for separation, citing a breakdown of trust and shared values. Apparently, He'd been having doubts about Paulette's character for a while, and the revelations at the party had confirmed his worst suspicions. Several of Paulette's friends publicly distanced themselves from her, and her social media presence, which had been carefully curated to present an image of perfect life, started filling with critical comments. Vincent's girlfriend Sloane made her breakup with him official via a post that didn't name him directly, but made it clear she'd ended things with someone who lacked integrity and moral character. Vincent's graduate program funding was reviewed after one of his professors, who'd been at the party, raised questions about his ethical standards, and while they didn't revoke his funding, he was placed on a kind of professional probation that would follow him throughout his academic career. Eugenie's business didn't collapse. He was too established for that, but his reputation took a serious hit in professional circles where reputation was everything. My mother tried multiple tactics to retaliate. She filed a police report claiming Id's stolen family property, specifically some jewelry that had supposedly been hers. But when police investigated and found no evidence of any theft, they warned her about filing false reports. Uncle Bernard made sure that warning went on record, establishing a pattern of her making false accusations. She tried to get my nursing license reviewed, contacting the state board with claims that I was emotionally unstable and shouldn't be working in healthcare, but the board dismissed her complaint after a brief investigation showed it was clearly retaliatory and baseless. She even tried to turn members of my father's family against me by contacting them individually with new lies. But Aunt Dorothy and Uncle Bernard had already reached out to everyone, sharing the evidence and the truth, so her attempts fell flat. Every move she made to hurt me backfired, creating more documentation of her vindictive character. Eugene made some attempts to threaten Uncle Bernard professionally, implying head-file ethics complaints about how Bernard was handling the trust fund case, but Bernard calmly pointed out that he was representing his niece in a clear case of trustee malfeasance and had welcomed any ethics review because his conduct had been impeccable while Eugenia's family had committed actual fraud. About 2 weeks after New Year's, I received a letter in the mail, handwritten on expensive stationery. It was from my mother, several pages long, and it read like something from a psychological thriller. She started by saying Shed been in therapy and had realized how wrong Shed been, how Shed let Eugene and his values corrupt her, how she wanted to make genuine amends. She said she understood if I couldn't forgive her immediately, but she wanted to start the process of healing our relationship. She invited me to lunch, just the two of us, at a quiet place where we could really talk without interruptions or pressure. She ended the letter by saying she loved me and always had, even when she'd done a terrible job of showing it. I read the letter twice, looking for any hint of genuine remorse or change, and found nothing but manipulation wrapped in therapy language. I called Aunt Dorothy immediately and read her the letter. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "It's another trap, sweetie. People like your mother don't change. They just get better at pretending." I called Uncle Bernard next, and he agreed with Aunt Dorothy's assessment. He said if I wanted to respond at all, I should only agree to meet in a public place with him present as my attorney. I decided to respond, not because I believed anything would change, but because I wanted to see what she was really trying to accomplish. I sent a brief email saying I'd received her letter, and if she genuinely wanted to talk, we could meet for coffee, but my attorney Uncle Bernard would need to be present to ensure everything remained civil and productive. Her response came within an hour, and the mask slipped. She said Shed wanted this to be between us, mother and daughter, and it was insulting that I'd bring a lawyer. She said if I really wanted to heal our relationship, I needed to show some trust and faith. I didn't respond, and 2 days later she emailed again, this time agreeing to the meeting with Uncle Bernard present, suggesting we meet at a cafe downtown. Uncle Bernard and I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early and chose a table near the window where we'd be visible to passers-by. My mother arrived exactly on time, dressed conservatively, her face arranged in an expression of sad humility. She sat down, greeted Uncle Bernard coldly, and then tried to take my hands across the table. I pulled back slightly, keeping my hands in my lap, and asked what she wanted to discuss. She launched into a speech that sounded rehearsed, talking about healing and forgiveness and family bonds. Then she pulled out a document from her expensive leather bag and slid it across the table. She said Shed had her attorney draw this up. It was a family agreement that would allow us all to move forward. Uncle Bernard picked up the document and started reading, and I watched his jaw tighten. He looked up at my mother and said, "This is a waiver. You're asking Marlene to waive any claim to her father's estate, to the trust fund you stole, to any future legal action. In exchange for what exactly?" My mother said in exchange for restored family relationships. Wasn't that worth more than money? Uncle Bernard actually laughed, a short, sharp sound. He said this document is coercive and potentially illegal, attempting to use emotional manipulation to get someone to waive legitimate legal claims. If Marlene signed this, it would likely be voidable in court anyway, but the attempt itself is actionable. My mother's face transformed, the sad humility disappearing instantly, replaced by cold anger. She said I was forcing her hand, that I was destroying the family, that Shed protected me and raised me and I owed her. Uncle Bernard stood and said, "This meeting is over, and if you attempt to contact my client again for any purpose other than settlement negotiations through attorneys, we'll be filing for a restraining order." We left her sitting there, her true nature fully exposed. The restraining order was granted a week later after Uncle Bernard filed a petition documenting the pattern of harassment, manipulation, attempted fraud, and coercive contact. The judge reviewed all our evidence, including the recordings, the trust fund theft documentation, the fake hospital emergency, and the recent attempt to get me to sign away my legal rights, and he granted a protective order requiring my mother, Eugene, Paulette, and Vincent to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, and my workplace. Any contact had to go through attorneys only. It felt like being released from a prison I'd been in so long I'd almost forgotten what freedom felt like. Around the same time, Uncle Bernard filed a civil lawsuit on my behalf against my mother for the stolen trust fund. He didn't actually expect to go to trial because the evidence was so overwhelming, and he was right. 2 months later, my mother's attorney reached out to negotiate a settlement. After some back and forth, we agreed on $50,000, representing my original inheritance plus some damages, though not nearly enough to account for all the years of interest and opportunity cost I'd lost. Uncle Bernard advised me to take the settlement rather than drag things out in court, and I agreed because it wasn't really about the money anymore. It was about justice and acknowledgement of what had been done to me. With the legal matters resolved and the restraining order in place, I finally had space to breathe and rebuild my life. My relationship with my father's side of the family deepened in ways I'd never imagined possible. Aunt Dorothy became someone I saw at least once a week, having dinner at her house or meeting for coffee. She shared stories about my father that my mother had never told me. Stories about his childhood and his dreams, and the kind of man had been. She showed me photos I'd never seen, videos of him from before I was born, and I fell in love with my father all over again as an adult, understanding him in ways my 7-year-old self couldn't have. Uncle Bernard became a mentor and father figure, helping me understand legal matters and financial planning, treating me like the niece Head always wanted to be close to but had been prevented from knowing. Cousin Iris became one of my closest friends, someone I could talk to about anything, someone who understood family trauma because Shed experienced her own version of it. One evening, about 3 months after the New Year's party, Aunt Dorothy asked me to come over because she had something for me. When I arrived at her house, she led me to her home office and pulled out a box from her closet. She said Shed been storing these for years, hoping someday Shed be able to give them to me. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to me in my father's handwriting. She explained that my father had written to me regularly in the months before his death, letters meant for me to receive as I grew up, at different milestones like my 10th birthday, my high school graduation, my wedding day, whenever I became a mother. Had apparently given them to Constance, with instructions about when to give me each one, trusting her to honor his wishes. Shed never given me a single letter. Aunt Dorothy said Shed discovered them years ago when helping clean out an attic and had confronted Constance, who'd made some excuse about forgetting about them and promised to give them to me. That never happened, but Aunt Dorothy had secretly made copies before returning the originals, knowing Constance couldn't be trusted. I spent that entire night reading those letters, crying through most of them. My father had known he wasn't going to be there to raise me. Somehow had known or feared it, and had wanted to leave me with his love and his wisdom. He wrote about how proud he was of me, how he knew I'd grow up to be strong and kind and brave. He gave me advice about navigating difficult situations, about staying true to my values, about not letting other people's treatment of me define my worth. In the letter meant for my 18th birthday, he wrote that Head created a trust fund for me, that the money was my inheritance from him and his parents, that it was meant to give me opportunities and security. Head trusted Constance to manage it properly until I came of age. And reading that now, knowing what Shed done, broke my heart all over again. But the last letter, the one meant for whenever I became truly independent and started my own life, was the most powerful. He wrote that Head always believed I'd be someone who stood up for what was right, even when it was hard, even when it cost me something. He said he was sorry he wouldn't be there to see me become the woman he knew I'd be, but he believed in me completely. He ended the letter by saying, "You are my sunshine, my little girl, my greatest achievement and my greatest joy, and nothing will ever change that. Not distance, not time, not even death, I will always be with you. 6 months after that New Year's Eve party, my life looked completely different. I'd received the settlement money from the trust fund lawsuit and used it as a down payment on a small house. Nothing fancy but mine, truly mine. Bought with money that should have been mine all along. My father's family helped me move in, and Aunt Dorothy cried when she saw how happy I was, how free. We had a housewarming party, intimate and warm, with people who actually cared about me. I got promoted at the hospital to a senior ICU nurse position with better hours and better pay. Recognition for my years of hard work and dedication. I continued therapy, working through the layers of trauma and learning to build healthy relationships with people who valued me. I started dating again, cautiously, having learned to recognize red flags and manipulation tactics, refusing to settle for anything less than genuine respect and kindness. As for my mother and her family, I heard updates occasionally through the grapevine, though I never reached out and they were legally required not to contact me. Eugene's business continued to decline, not catastrophically, but steadily, as word spread through his professional network about his character issues. Several major deals fell through when potential partners did background research and found the public records of the lawsuit and restraining order. Paulette's divorce finalized, and Shed apparently moved back in with Constance and Eugene, unable to afford her previous lifestyle on her own salary. Vincent dropped out of his graduate program after the academic probation and ongoing reputation issues made it clear he wouldn't have the career prospects he'd been counting on. Constance herself became increasingly isolated as her social circle learned the truth and quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone who'd treat their own daughter so cruelly. Their lives weren't destroyed, they were too resourceful and too shameless for that, but they faced natural consequences for their actions, and I took a certain satisfaction in knowing that truth had eventually mattered. The most important thing I learned through all of this was that family isn't defined by blood or legal relationships. Family is defined by behavior, by how people treat you, by whether they lift you up or tear you down. I'd spent 3 decades trying to earn love from people who were constitutionally incapable of giving it, and another 3 years healing from the damage that caused. That Christmas dinner where I paid $847 for a meal I'd been tricked into hosting turned out to be the best money I ever spent because it gave me the clarity and courage I needed to break free completely. That check bought me my freedom, even though I didn't realize it at the time. I found my real family in Aunt Dorothy and Uncle Bernard and Iris and all the relatives who'd been kept from me by lies and manipulation. I found my real family in the friends who stood by me, the colleagues who respected me, the therapist who helped me heal, the community I built around myself, of people who chose to love me, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. I no longer check my mother's social media, or wonder what she thinks of me, or hope for her approval. I don't need it anymore. I don't need validation from people who never valued me. I've built a life that's rich and full and genuine, surrounded by people who see me and appreciate me, and celebrate my successes without jealousy or calculation. I sleep peacefully now, without the anxiety that used to wake me at 3 a.m., worrying about what I'd done wrong or how I could fix things with family who didn't want to be fixed. I look at photos of myself from before, from during those years when I was still trying to earn their love, and I barely recognize that person. She looks tired and sad and small, like she was trying to take up as little space as possible. The woman I am now takes up space unapologetically, speaks her truth clearly, sets boundaries firmly, and doesn't accept crumbs when she deserves the whole meal. That Christmas dinner taught me the most valuable lesson of my life, and I share this story hoping it might help someone else who's going through something similar. If you have family members who only contact you when they need something, who treat you differently than other relatives, who manipulate and exploit and then blame you for being hurt, please hear this. You deserve better. You are worth more. And the best gift you can give yourself is walking away from people who only pretend to love you when they need something. Real love doesn't come with conditions or price tags. Real family builds you up rather than tearing you down. And sometimes, the family you choose, the people who aren't blood related but who choose to love you anyway, those people are worth more than all the biological connections in the world. I've never looked back, and I've never been happier. That's how my story ends. Not with revenge or bitterness, but with peace and genuine love and the freedom to be myself without apology. So now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members? And if so, how did you find the courage to do it? What helped you heal afterward? Drop your stories in the comments because I know I'm not alone in this experience, and sharing our truths helps break the isolation these manipulative people create. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel because I'll be sharing more stories about overcoming family trauma and building lives of genuine connection. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that they're not crazy for seeing manipulation, that their feelings are valid, that they deserve better treatment. Thank you so much for watching and for letting me share my journey with you. I wish you all a new year filled with genuine love, honest relationships, and the courage to walk away from anyone who doesn't treat you with the respect you deserve. You are worthy of love, you are valuable exactly as you are, and you don't need to earn basic human decency from anyone. Remember that. Protect your peace, and surround yourself only with people who celebrate you rather than tolerate you. Take care of yourselves out there,